Okay, let's check you guys can hear all right. Does the sound okay over here for you guys? Yeah? Got a nod? Okay, what about you guys at the back? You okay for sound? Good? You okay for sound? Yep. You guys are fine in here too? Good. Okay, okay, make a start. Just one administrative thing is I've already had emails from people who didn't do very well in the mid-semester test, and they somehow, because of that, they conclude that there's no point in doing the online quizzes anymore. That's actually a bad idea, giving up on the online quizzes. One of the main reasons for that is that if for any reason you're sick or can't come to that final exam, and we have to consider whether you deserve a special pass, if you skipped those quizzes, you'll fail. If you do those quizzes and you can't come to that final exam, it usually hinges around whether you did those quizzes and how well you did. So even if you think that they're not going to actually count toward your final grade because you intend to turn up and do well in that final exam, it's still worthwhile doing them just in case something happens and you can't make it. Right. Okay, so today we're going to start swaps. This is the last of our derivatives topics that we're going to talk about. Now, this one is slightly different to some of the other derivatives we've looked at so far, in that what we said with derivatives is basically that there is no money gained or lost from them. Simply, there's if someone wins, the other party loses by exactly the same amount. With a swap, there is an actual initial gain to both parties, but once that gain has been made, then any further gain to one party will be offset by an identical loss to the other party. So apart from that initial gain, it's much like any other derivatives in terms of the payoffs. If there's a payoff to one, there's a corresponding loss to the other. Now, in terms of the size of the swap market itself, if you take it globally, is around about 5 times the size of the entire economic output of the world. If we look at the U.S. banks only, these are just U.S. banks, this is the types of derivatives entered into by the U.S. banks, and these ones here down the bottom, these are credit derivatives, which we don't cover. The top ones, the blue, that's futures and forwards. We covered that last term. The green are options. And the big orange ones, these are the swaps. So the swaps which we're going to be talking about as far as the banks are concerned, that is the major derivative that they are involved in. And if we then break it down by the 4 major banks versus everybody else, for the breakdown, the orange is the 4 major banks who are the ones that act as dealers in these markets, the major dealers, and they're the orange. So this is a swap here. Swap market, and so that's at that, and this was 2016 data. They had about $110 trillion in swaps, and about $100 trillion of that was held by the top 4 banks, who are basically acting as dealers. And the little blue out here is all other U.S. banks combined. So the swaps are as far as the banks are concerned, the biggest derivative positions that they engage in. So the question is, what are they? What is a swap? Anyone over the break, read ahead, figure out what a swap is? Did you read ahead? You didn't. Oh. Do you have any idea? No? No. Okay. So when you think about a swap, if you're actually familiar with what a forward is, a swap is simply like a group of them. You group them, a bunch of forwards together. And what you do in them is you have some nominal amount that you are going to engage in a swap over, and then you actually swap cash flows. And what we're going to do in this particular part of the course is we're going to look at interest rate swaps. There are other types, but once you understand how an interest rate swap works, then the other ones are really self-explanatory as about how they would work as well. So you start off with a nominal amount of money. That's what becomes the nominal amount, the principal for that swap. And then typically one side of the swap takes a fixed position, so that they're actually paying a fixed interest rate, and the other one pays a floating rate, and they exchange the cash flows between them. Now, typically, when you're looking at the floating rates, they're tied to something, a major benchmark. The LIBOR is very common in international swaps. That's because that's a major interest rate. Another place you might see an interest rate benchmark used is the bank bill swap rate, and one of the examples that we have later on is used using the bank bill swap rate. And so when they're used, typically they're used to hedge an interest rate risk. So if you have a fixed rate, say a fixed rate payment you have to make, but you would prefer to have floating, and you can't renegotiate your loan with the provider, you could enter a swap to transform it from a fixed to a floating. And when we look at them, there are some funny things in there. One is that there's credit risk differences between the parties, and we'll see a little bit how this works, which actually gives them this initial gain at the start. So the swap dealers themselves, when we talk about the markets, we know that there's basically two types. There's an exchange market, and then there's a dealer market. In the swap market, it's dealer markets. So if you're going to engage in a swap, you actually talk directly to a dealer, and you arrange a swap with them to meet the needs that you have. And typically, because the dealers, when you look at things like this, the banks having $100 trillion worth of swaps because they've entered into them as dealers, they'll take one side of a swap, and then they'll go and try to find another party to take the other side, and they try to keep themselves nicely hedged so that they have an equal amount on the floating as they do on the fixed, and so gains on one side will be offset by losses on the other side, and they'll simply take a cut in the middle, but they'll have their price risk removed by hedging on both sides. So they don't like to be unbalanced in terms of what they actually hold. Now, for the banks, what this stuff here is, the risk-based capital support. We'll come to that in the section after the foreign exchange. But bank regulators look at these things, and there's risk associated with them. And when you think about what capital is for, and we'll come to exactly what that is next week, they require banks to hold capital in case of unexpected losses in this market. Now, in the swap market itself, there are other dealers out there apart from banks, and the other two major ones are investment banks, which there's different beasts to a commercial bank, and the insurance companies, neither of which typically neither of which have a regulatory capital requirement, and a capital requirement is a cost to a financial institution, and so there's often a claim made that the investment banks and the insurance companies are actually slightly better advantage to a commercial bank simply because they don't have to hold this risk-based capital. Now, when you look at how much the, let's say, go back to this one here, and you look at what these four big banks are, only one of these is an investment bank. The other three are normal commercial banks. And so, although maybe this argument has some merit that they have a slight disadvantage, it can't be a huge one because they are the major dealers in this market. Now, one thing about them is that the markets themselves are not particularly well regulated by regulators. If you look at the Australian market, APRA does have a small involvement in the swap market, but largely the market itself is self-regulated, and this particular association, the International Swap Dealers Association, has been at the forefront of setting up best practices and self-regulating the market so that people who are engaging in this market at least can understand what the agreements are, what their legal rights are, what the legal obligations are, and if things come to grief, then these voluntary agreements tend to form the basis of whatever legal action is taken. So now we get down to what they are. So what we're going to look at this one is we'll look at the internal cash flows in the swap. Now, typically, when you look at these things, there are cash flows outside going out there. We will add those in later. But this is the basic internal cash flows in a swap. So there's two banks there, A and B, and if you look at the bottom one first, B is paying a fixed rate. So it's this 8.75%. It's paying this fixed rate on whatever the nominal amount was, which in this case was 50 million, and it pays that over to Bank A. Now on the other side, there's a cash, so this is cash flow in this direction. Up here, there's a cash flow in the opposite direction, and what A will pay B is LIBOR. There's your floating rate, and there's a risk adjustment of -8%. So A is paying B the LIBOR, that's that floating rate, minus -0.25% on the 50 million, and then B is paying A the 8.75% on exactly the same amount, the 50 million. Now in practice, they don't actually trade the full cash flows. What they do is they work out what the net is, and only the net amount is moved. So when you see huge numbers like $100 trillion in swaps, in actual fact, comparatively small amounts of money move between parties. The nominal amount may be very large, but the actual amount moved between the two parties can be comparatively small. It simply depends on the interest rate differential between the LIBOR minus the 0.8% and the 8.75%, which is the fixed one. So let's look at how they're used. So this is the example we're going to consider. We've got this 3-year swap between Microsoft and Intel. In the swap agreement, Microsoft is going to pay Intel a fixed rate of 5% per annum. So there's your fixed rate there. And notional principal is $100 million. Now that notional principal does not get exchanged. It's only the basis of the calculation for what the actual net payment should be. But when you look at that, a graph like this one, that 100 million would be what they're talking about here. So that's the nominal amount, not the actual amount that's being moved back and forth between the two parties. So on the other side, the floating rate, Intel is going to pay Microsoft, and they're going to pay a 6-month LIBOR rate, and then they're going to exchange these payments every 6 months. So over the life of the swap, 3 years, 6 monthly payments, they're going to be 6 payments all up. So this is what it looks like here. So here's your two parties up here, Microsoft there, Intel there. You have a floating rate leg, which is the LIBOR, and then you have the fixed rate. So there's your floating, and there's your fixed. Now, we will add extra cash flows out there, which begins to make sense why they do this thing when we add those cash flows in on the outside to the outside. But for now, we're just going to look at the internal part of the swap. So this is what happens. This is the cash flows from Microsoft's point of view. Here's the 6-month LIBOR in this column here. Here's the dates. And so when it was initially set up, the LIBOR was at 4.2%. So that sets the floating rate for the next 6-month period. At the end of that 6-month period, this is when the first cash flows actually move. So what happens is half of the 4.2 is 2.1%. And so if you look here, Intel's got to pay $2.1 million over to Microsoft as part of that swap, because they're paying the floating. That's this one up here. And then, of course, for Microsoft, there's a minus 2.5 million because that's the cash flow out associated with them. So once they've done the calculation, in actual fact, there's only a net cash outflow for Microsoft. It has, in actual fact, only a $400,000 cash flow, and that's a net cash flow that goes out from Microsoft. But at that point, at this point here, when the payment is made on that first 6-month period, the floating rate is now reset. So they go out, they look at the LIBOR and say, what's it today? And that becomes the interest rate that then applies to the next 6 months. And so the interest rate in this particular case was 4.8%, and that applies for the coming 6 months. So after 6 months, now we're a whole year down the track, it's going to receive from Intel $2.4 million from Intel, so that's part of the floating rate. And because they're paying fixed, they still have to pay out their $2.5 million. And so there's only a net transfer of $100,000 or $0.1 million. And that goes from Microsoft to Intel. And at that point, they go out and look at the LIBOR again. Here we're at this date here. LIBOR is now at 5.3%, and that becomes the interest rate for the next 6 months. And so as we go on in time, the cash flows change. The fixed rate doesn't change because it's fixed, but the floating rate can rise and fall as floating rates do. In this case, we have a systematic rise in the interest rate on that floating rate. And so it initially starts out with Microsoft paying money out, a net payment out to Intel, but as time goes on and the floating rate goes up, then Microsoft receives a net payment from Intel. And at the end of it there, they're getting about $450,000 at the end of that last 6 months period. Okay, any questions on this before we go any further? Yeah, go ahead.
Just for this example, then you work with Microsoft and Intel, there must have a rate difference for them to do that with the swap and the tax.
Yeah, well, when we start adding the cash flows to the outside, particularly if we're going to, say, transform some borrowing, okay, then the credit difference is the thing that drives whether this is worthwhile doing or not. And so when we start adding in the extra cash flows that are from Microsoft to the outside world, from Intel to the outside world, the credit difference at that point becomes important. And that's what we'll look at exactly how that works, and we'll do a couple of examples of working out how we actually make a gain to ourselves by using a swap. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so if you did put in the notional value, the extra 100 million, in actual fact, it doesn't change anything because there at the end, you have that extra 100 million thrown in there, but it doesn't change the net. So the fact that the notional principal is not involved doesn't actually make any difference to the net cash flow. It's exactly the same. All these other numbers are exactly the same. So now we're going to start to add in some of these outside cash flows to sort of see how there might be some benefit to us. So here's an example, again, based on the one we just had. So Intel and Microsoft, they've got this swap. Intel is paying over the floating rate, the LIBOR, and then Intel receives from Microsoft this 5%. So here's the example. We assume that Microsoft has got $100 million in bonds. They're paying 4.7% per annum over the next 3 years, so that's fixed. So what Microsoft, for whatever reason, wants to do, it's got this fixed rate bond, but really what it would want, it really wants to have a floating rate bond. But rather than selling it and then going and buying a floating rate bond, they can continue to hold their fixed rate bond, and they can use the swap to effectively change that into a floating rate. So when we look at how this works, if you look at the cash flows from Microsoft's point of view, it receives in from Intel, it receives the LIBOR. Okay, so it receives LIBOR. Okay, see that coming into Microsoft. It also receives the 4.7% from the bond. So this is your cash flow in, and there's two of them. Okay, one comes from Intel on the swap. The other one comes from its bonds. So the two cash flows in. Now, there is one cash flow out for Microsoft's concern, that's that fixed 5%, and so we subtract off the 5% for the fixed out, so that's your cash flow out. And what we end up with is a LIBOR minus 0.3%. And as long as the LIBOR is sufficiently big, bigger than 0.3%, this is a cash flow in. So what effectively has happened here is that Microsoft had a fixed rate asset. It entered into a swap and effectively transformed that into a floating rate asset. That's essentially what's happened with this one. Okay, any question on that before we go to the next one? Okay. So the other thing it could do is it could actually do it the other way around. It has a floating rate obligation. In this case, it's borrowed money on a floating rate, and would really rather have a fixed rate. But rather than going back to its lender and trying to renegotiate it, they may find it simpler to go out and enter into a swap. So if we look at the cash flows on this one, so if we look at the cash flows into Microsoft, there's only one. There's only one cash flow into Microsoft, and that's the LIBOR. So in this case, the LIBOR comes in. That's a cash flow in. And when we look at what goes out, there's the LIBOR plus the 0.1%. That's going to their outside lender. And they're also paying out another 5% in the swap to Intel. So these are your cash flows out, and of which there's two of them. And ultimately, in this particular case, they're going to pay out 5.1%, and that's a cash flow out. So what they've been able to do is that they have a floating rate obligation, in this case a floating rate debt. They have kept that, but they have used a swap to effectively turn the floating rate debt into a fixed rate debt, and the fixed rate that they're now paying on the debt is 5.1%. Okay, any question on that before we go on? Okay, everybody's happy. So now we're going to put in the cash flows for two of them, and actually start to see where on earth the gain comes from. So what we have here is an example, and we'll work through this example. So we've got these two companies, AAA and BBB. Very nicely, their names are their credit ratings. And there's two markets out there for borrowing. There's a fixed rate market, and there's a floating. And AAA, when we look at that, what it is quoted for, goes out to its lender and say, what can I borrow at? And they say, well, for fixed, you can borrow from us at 10%. If you want floating, we'll charge you the LIBOR plus 0.3%. Now, B's in the market for some money as well, so they go to their outside lender. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same one as AAA, but they go out to their lender and say, well, I want to borrow some money. What's the story? And they say, oh, well, you have to pay 11.2% if you want fixed money from us. If you want floating rate, we'll charge you LIBOR plus 1%. That's what we'll charge you for your money. Now, when we look at that loan table, which of those two companies has the absolute advantage? AAA. In both cases, it can get its borrowing cheaper than BBB can. So we have an absolute advantage for AAA in both markets. Now, how many people are familiar with comparative advantage from your economic courses? People remember what it is? A few people? Good. Okay, so which of those has a comparative advantage in the fixed? Okay. not too sure? The way you do this to figure it out is that you take the difference between them. So we'll take the difference, and in the fixed rate market, there's a 1.2% difference between them. In the floating, it's actually only 0.7%. Now, where it is wider, the one with the absolute advantage has the comparative advantage. So this AAA is said to have the comparative advantage in fixed, whereas B has the comparative advantage in floating. Now, we can make a gain from a swap only under one particular condition. If you think about, there's 4 ways that they could go out and borrow their money. The first is, maybe they both want fixed. If that's the case, we can't make a swap work. Same thing, if they both want floating, we can't make a swap work for them. If they want to borrow where they have the comparative advantage, we can't make it work either. It's only in the case where each company wants to borrow in the market that the other one has the comparative advantage that we can actually make a swap work. And so in this case, it has to be the case that AAA wants to borrow money at a floating rate for whatever reasons it wants to do that. That's what it wants to do. And B also has to want to borrow fixed. That's where A has the comparative advantage. If that's the case, okay, none of only 4 ways that money could be borrowed, this is the only one where we can make a swap work. So if B wants to borrow where A has the comparative advantage, and A wants to borrow in the market where B has the comparative advantage, then we can set the swap up and make it work. Now, the question is, how much can we gain? And so if we take the difference between these two, take these two to here, and the difference between those two is, that's the available gain to these parties, and that's 1.2% minus 0.7%, and there's a potential gain there of 0.5%. Now that's across both of them. Now to make things simple, what we'll do is we'll split this gain between both of them evenly. So we'll give them 0.25% each. So gain to each is going to be 0.25%. Now at this point, we can actually work out their final borrowing costs. Because if you look at what the numbers suggest here, AAA wants to have a floating rate. That's what they want to have. If they went out and borrowed directly from their outside lender, they would have to pay the LIBOR plus the 0.3%. With a swap, we can gain them 0.25%. That means 0.25% cheaper. And so we're going to end up, in the end, after the swap is done, with AAA paying LIBOR plus 0.5%. So we're going to knock 0.25% off their borrowing costs. Similarly, B, if they went and borrowed fixed directly, they'd have to pay 11.2%. We can get them 0.25% off, and that means they're going to end up paying 10.95 after the swap is done. Okay, because that's going to help us figure out how on earth to make the swap work. So after swap, we can work out what their payments are. So AAA will pay LIBOR plus 0.05%, and that's the LIBOR plus 3 minus their gain, and BBB is going to pay 10.95%, and that's the 11.2% they would have taken had they gone directly, minus the gain they're going to make out of the swap. Okay, any questions on these numbers to this point? Because we haven't made a swap yet, but we're going to make one soon. Any question on how we got any of these numbers? Okay, so we're going to set the swap up, and we'll figure out how on earth to make this thing work for. So here's AAA here, and over here is BBB. And they both go out to their outside lenders and they borrow where they have the comparative advantage. And so, let's see, this is the 10% one here. So A goes out and pays 10% to its outside lender. BBB pays the LIBOR. And you can see plus the 1% to the outside lender. And now we've got that set up. They've gone out to the outside lenders. They borrowed their money. And now we're going to build the swap. So there's going to be a floating rate leg in there and a fixed rate leg in there. And the question is, how on earth do we set this thing up to make this gain? And the simplest thing to do, and I say the simplest thing to do because in actual fact there are an infinite ways to set up, number of ways to set up a swap. But we don't want an infinite number of ways. We want a nice, simple way. The simplest thing to do is to put whatever that floating rate benchmark is through on its own with no adjustments. So what we do is we simply put the LIBOR through there and make all the adjustments on the fixed rate leg. But we don't know, at this stage, we don't know what the fixed leg is. But we do know what each one is going to pay when it's all done and dusted. So that means that we can work out what this unknown fixed rate payment is. So if we think at it from A's point of view, for AAA, it pays out 10% in its fixed rate to its outside lender. It then pays out the LIBOR across to B, and then it receives what is currently unknown, the X. And we know from what we worked out that it has to be this LIBOR plus 0.5%. So that's got to equal LIBOR plus 0.05%. And so that means that the X, which currently was unknown, has got to be 9.95%. So that's the 9.95% there. So this swap means that AAA has got its borrowing at 0.25% lower than it would have done if it had gone out and borrowed directly what it wanted. Now, we can check this. We can check that we haven't made a mistake by looking at the cash flows for BBB. When we look at BBB, it has this 9.95%. That's a cash flow out. It has to pay the LIBOR out, plus this credit adjustment of 1% here, and then it receives the LIBOR as part of the swap, and you add those two things together, and it comes up to 10.95%, and that matches what we said their borrowing costs would be. Okay. We worked out what their final borrowing costs would be. We worked out what the fixed rate leg was going to be here, and we can double check that we actually got that right by poking it in and doing the calculation for B. In this case, we've come up with exactly the same figure that we said we would come up with, and so we can be pretty sure that we did that calculation right. Okay. Any questions on that? So there are some theoretical questions about why this is actually like this, why there is this gain to be made. But it is a persistent thing that we see in the markets that because of the credit differentials between them, they often have, if you look at the credit differentials, that what they actually charge is narrower on the floating rate than it is on the fixed. And that's what drives the incentive for borrowers to enter into a swap, assuming that it meets their needs. No point entering into a swap if it doesn't meet your needs. Okay, so there it is. If you throw in a financial institution in the middle, again, all you have to do is put the floating rate through unchanged along this edge and do all the adjustments along there. In this case, if they're charging 0.4% or 0.04% for their fee, then you simply make the adjustment on the fixed side. That is the easiest way to do it. As I said, there are an infinite number of ways of doing this, but this is the simplest. Just put that floating rate benchmark through no adjustments on the floating rate leg, do all the adjustments on the fixed rate side, and that's the easiest way to make these things work. Okay, so there's all the numbers, blah, blah, blah. I think we said that bit too. Okay, so here's another example. So get another paper. So we got these two companies, All's Ales, AA, and Barnacle Boats, BB, and they need $5.5 million. So if we start to set this up, we looked at there's the two markets, the fixed and the floating. And for AA, they are quoted 7.4% if they want fixed, and the bank bill swap rate plus 2.0% if they want floating, and that will be, in this case, 8.8%, and on the fixed and float bank bill swap rate plus 2.2% on the floating. So again, which of those has the absolute advantage in both markets? Yeah, AA has the absolute advantage in both markets. In both cases, they can get its money cheaper than BB can. Okay, but which one has the comparative advantage in the fixed? AA. And which one has the comparative advantage in the floating? Yeah, BB. So if AA wants to borrow floating and BB wants to borrow fixed, then we have the conditions to set up a swap. And we think, well, how much can we gain? How much can we gain for these people? So if we take the differences, and here's the differences. So there's 1.4% difference there. And on this side, there's only a 0.2% difference there. And so the gain is going to be 1.4% minus 0.2%. And that's a 1.2% gain. And if we split them evenly, equal amounts, 0.6% each. Now, once we know that we can gain them 0.6%. What that means is we're going to end up with borrowing 0.6% below what they would have had to pay if they went out and borrowed directly. So if they went and borrowed directly, what would they have had to pay, say, for AA? If they went and borrowed directly on the floating? Actually, we'd have to, if the borrow floating would be the other one, bank bill swap rate plus 2. Okay. Now, if they're going to use the swap, what's their floating rate going to be after the swap has taken place? If we engage the swap for them and we save them 0.6%, what are their borrowing costs going to be for floating? Yeah, AA. If AA enters in the swap, what is its borrowing cost going to be for floating? Yeah. Okay, BBSW, that's the bank bill swap rate. And so what they will pay is that's the floating rate there, bank bill swap rate, plus 1.4%. Because they would have had to pay the 2% extra if they'd gone and borrowed directly. What we're going to do is gain them 0.6%. So we knock that off that one there, get their money cheaper, and they will have a borrowing cost at bank bill swap rate plus 1.4% after the swap. So what about B? What's its borrowing cost going to be after the swap? 8.2? Yeah, it's 8.8 minus the 0.6, and so they're going to pay 8.2%. So we can work out, and it's important to work this out before you try to build the swap, is to figure out what on earth is it going to be their final borrowing costs. So now we can build the swap because we've got all the information we need. So here's AA, and it borrows where it has the comparative advantage. So it pays 7.4% to its outside lender, BB, borrows where it has the comparative advantage, so it pays the bank bill swap rate plus the 2.2% to its outside lender, and then we're going to put two legs in here, a floating and a fixed. Now again, the simplest thing is whatever that floating rate benchmark is, and in this case it's the bank bill swap rate, just put that through with no modifications, and so it's going to be paid from A to B. And so now we can use this information here to work out what this unknown fixed rate is going to be. So what we know, if we look at for AA, and look at it's going to pay out 7.4%. It's going to pay out the bank bill swap rate, and it's going to receive currently an unknown amount on the fixed, but we know that's got to end up as being equal to the bank bill swap rate plus the 1.4%. And so in this case, the fixed rate is 6%. So that's equal to 6% there. And we can double check that this is right by analyzing B, because we know what B is going to pay 8.2%, so we can check this, make sure this is right. So for double B, we look at its cash flows. It pays out bank bill swap rate plus 2.2% to its outside lender, so that's that one there. It also pays out another 6% to AA as part of the swap, and it receives back the bank bill swap rate, and that comes out 2.2 plus 6, 8.2%, and that is what we said they would pay. So we can be pretty sure that this rate here is right in terms of the fixed rate. Okay, any question on how we made one of those? All very quiet. All very quiet. Okay, so that's the basic idea. If you go to other types of swaps like foreign exchange swaps, equity swaps, and so on, the basic principle is the same. And once you understand how an interest rate swaps work, then the other types of swaps, when you see them, it won't take much to figure out how on earth they work and what the advantages of them are. But this is the big one. The interest rate swap is the big one as far as the banks are concerned. This is by far their biggest derivative positions. And as you can saw from those data we had, they had $110 trillion in interest rate swaps. And that's the U.S. market alone. The rest of the world, you put that together, and it's somewhere, let me see, it's around about 350 trillion worldwide for the swaps. Okay. Right. That was for drawing pictures. So this is the derivatives question from a few years ago now. So this hopefully just to remind you we did last one, because this one's not a swap. So let's do this as just a quick review. This should be, we hope by now, relatively straightforward to do. So we've got this New Zealand company, they've got an export contract for supply of wine, and they're going to get paid in British pounds. They're going to get paid £482,000, and the payment's going to be made on the 20th of December. It's August now, and they want to hedge their foreign exchange risk. So first one up, how would they do that with a forward contract? If they want to hedge that risk with a forward contract, what would they do? What would they do? You don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
Take a sell position on British pounds. So in the January after they receive the payment, because it'd be the soonest they could do it, they would sell an amount of British pounds at a rate which would be fixed when they enter the contract.
Right. So with a forward contract, though, okay, you can customize this to anything you needed. And so when you talk to your dealer, you'd make it for the 20th of December, and you'd make it for $482,000. So that's the good thing about the forward. Whatever your specific needs are, you can ring up your dealer, talk to them, and get exactly what you need. Now, you've already answered the futures question. Is when you go to the futures market, everything's standardized there. So you can't get exactly what you need, but you can get pretty close. So the question is, if the contract size is £100,000 and your payment is going to be $482, would you take 5 contracts or 4? Because one would be $400,000, the other would be $500,000. Would you take 4 contracts or 5? 5. Simply because it's closer. Okay. 5 contracts. And you already said, why would you take the January one?
Because you want it as soon as possible after you receive the money, so that the additional risk you're exposed to in the meantime is lost.
Okay. Now, in one sense, you could use the other ones, because when it comes to the time where you get your money, what you would actually do is you would trade your £482,000 on the spot market, and on exactly the same time, you would close out your position. So all you need is a futures that goes beyond the 20th of December. There's no point taking a long one. You might as well take that January one. But when it comes to you get that money, you trade it on the spot market, and at exactly the same time, you close out your position, and any gains and losses from your position in the futures market will offset what you've gains and losses in the spot market. But noting, of course, that you're not actually exactly matched there. Okay, that makes sense to me? Okay, so let's say you still wanted to have the ability to gain if the exchange rate moved in your favor. What would you do if you had, instead, you wanted to hedge using an option? What would you do? Contract size, same. Maturity dates, same. Okay, yeah. So you probably want to put option to sell put option to sell the British pounds. You take 5 contracts because that best matches what you have, not exact. And again, you want to go beyond your December date, so you take the January one. Now, you could exercise the American options on the 20th of December. Would it be worth doing so? Depends. What does it depend on?
Depends on the currency exchange rate.
Well, let's say it's worthwhile. Let's say it's actually would be worthwhile doing in what in the sense that it's in the money. It would give you an actual payoff. Would it be worth exercising it as compared to selling it on market? Oh, time's running out. So the answer to this one is that it's always worthwhile selling that American option rather than exercising it because there is still time value left. If you exercise it, you lose the time value. If you close out on the market, then you gain that time value, and that's a little bit extra to you. Okay, so that wraps up the derivatives, and we'll start foreign exchange tomorrow. If you want to ask any questions, be around for a while. Otherwise, see you tomorrow.